This is a talk on technology and human finitude. Finitude is a theme in the ethical tradition of the West. It's present in the Bible. Remember, the Bible enjoins human beings not to create idols. They're to worship the God who created them. They're not to create their own creator in the form of an idol. There's a certain modesty that is required of the created being that we are. The Greeks also echoed the same sentiment. The oracle at Delphi had engraved on it the phrase, "Know thyself." Now, this was not about psychological introspection. Know thyself meant know that you are a mortal, not a god. For those who didn't follow the good advice of the oracle, there was a word, hubris. This word signifies the overweening pride of those who don't accept their lowly status as mere mortals. Hubris is a good starting point for an ethics of technology. I'm going to illustrate this idea of hubris with the first atomic explosion. You probably know that the atom bomb was invented in the US. The person who first created it, who organized the creation of the bomb, was J. Robert Oppenheimer, a physicist. He was a student of the Hindu scriptures, and when he saw that first test explosion in the New Mexico desert, he was so shocked that a phrase came to his mind from the Bhagavad Gita, "I am become death, the shatterer of worlds." This is a phrase spoken by Shiva, the god of destruction, and for a brief moment, Oppenheimer seems to have identified himself with the god. But it didn't take him long to realize that this was hubris, that the United States was not a god, could not rule the world without taking account of others. Why? Because the Russians were going to get the bomb. Oppenheimer knew this. He had studied with the Russian scientists who would soon create it. And so he asked diplomats in the US government to devise a disarmament scheme which could be presented to the Russians. This didn't work out, but it gives an idea of the gap between the hubristic notion of all-powerful, godlike, of an all-powerful godlike stance on the world and a realistic acceptance of limits. The rest of this talk will be in two parts. First, I'm going to talk about ontology, about what we are, and then about democracy, technology, and society. We'll start with Newton. The third law of motion says that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Now, Newton was thinking of physical objects, of planets and billiard balls and apples falling from trees. He did not have in mind human relations. But in fact, human relations perform metaphorically pretty much like Newton's third law. If you treat people well, they'll treat you well. If you act angry, they'll act angry. If you're kind, they'll be kind. So these are cases of equal and opposite reactions in human relations. And the reason for this is that human beings, as finite beings, can only act on a system to which they belong. If you belong to the system, that means that any change you make in the system will eventually come back to you. So what goes around comes around, as they say in California. I call this the paradox of action. In acting, we become the objects of action. Technology, however, appears to defy Newton. It looks like a non-Newtonian action in which the technological actor changes little and the object on which he acts changes a lot. This is, in fact, what I call the technical illusion. the idea that there is no feedback to the actor from the object of action. It gives people the illusion of a godlike relation to the world. And this results in notions such as the conquest of nature. Can we really conquer nature when we ourselves are clearly a part of nature? The conqueror ends up being conquered by his object because it comes back to haunt him. This is the meaning of finitude. Here's an illustration of this concept. You can see the pollution pouring out of the factory. So the technical action does have impacts on human beings, on their lungs, in this case. F. Scott Fitzgerald, in a different context, said, "The victor belongs to the spoils," which is a good way of signifying the impossibility of escaping Newton's law. Well, there are different types of feedback, and you can discover them by enlarging the context in time and space. If you just stick to the immediate action, say hammering a nail, you don't get much evidence of feedback. But if you look at the larger framework within which that hammering takes place, you'll find that there are a whole variety of feedbacks that occur. The actor is affected. In the first instance, by causal feedback. As we see in the previous slide, pollution is an instance of feedback from the technical object to the actor. There's also feedback to meaning, to identity. Who you are as a person is in large part determined by the technologies that you deploy in your life. In the case, for example, of a carpenter, he uses the tools of his trade, and in so doing, becomes a carpenter. And there are many more instances in which our technological actions alter our identity. Then there's also feedback to the world in which we live, to space and time, for example. When you talk about something being near or far, you don't necessarily think about automobiles and airplanes, but clearly they have transformed what it means for something to be near or far. The same is true of time, the short-term considerations that concern us in daily life give us one sense of time. The long-term gives us another, and this shows up in the case of climate change, where we can no longer ignore those long-term considerations, those long-term implications of our technical actions. In sum, you are what you do. Now, this is especially significant in the case of what Michel Serres called world objects. Today, we create objects on a world scale, a planetary scale. Nuclear weapons was the first visible example, and obviously, nuclear weapons have implications for human life on Earth, because if we ever actually used them, we'd be finished. So you can't say there's no feedback from nuclear weapons. It would be catastrophic. Climate change has been going on longer, but it only really became a noticeable problem in recent years. And it too is an example of a world object. By burning fossil fuels, we have altered the atmosphere, and that is affecting us. Bigger storms, hotter summers, and eventually, of course, far worse consequences. So our problem is that we can control nature to some extent, but we can't seem to get a handle on our own actions. We can't control our control. We can't stop nuclear weapons from existing. We can't seem to stop climate change from progressing. And this is a function of our technological hubris, our illusion of being able to control nature, when in fact there are serious limits to what we can actually do. Now I want to turn to the second part of the talk on technology and society. This is almost invisible to us. We think of social groups as people who interact. But of course, people can't really interact very much unless there's some technology that brings them together. And it's that which we tend to ignore. It's that technological mediation of group interaction that disappears from our usual thinking about our social life. But take the case of the city, for example. You think of yourself as a person who lives in a certain city, say you're a Vancouverite. But that's not just a relation to other Vancouverites. It's only possible for you to live in the city because of the roads, the electrical systems, the water systems, the whole infrastructure of city life, which makes the place livable and creates then the possibility of this large social group called citizens of Vancouver. But this is true also at the smaller level of a class. For example, this class, which is brought together by the technologies that we're using right now. Now, not only are human beings affected by these tools that they employ to create their social world, but they then turn around and change the technologies. We modify the technologies that modify us. And this is called the co-construction of technology and society. It creates a never-ending cycle in which people are constantly engaged in fixing and improving and modifying their technical mediations that bring them together in social groups. I call these democratic interventions into technology. And they stem from the limitations of technology. Again, finitude at work. And there are two kinds of limitations. Limitations that are inherent in the nature of technology, and limitations that stem from the social mechanisms that govern it. In the first place, there is a technological flaw, a fundamental technological flaw, which is also what makes technology possible. And this is the fact that we simplify nature in making it enter into our technical systems. We decontextualize pieces of nature and take from nature only what is useful. So we cut down the tree, cut off the branches. No longer is there a space for birds to nest. All the ecological implications of the tree's life have now been removed. And what's left are boards with which, say, to build a house. And that's fine. However, in simplifying nature in this way, we have left out a lot of its complexity. And sometimes that gives rise to unintended consequences of our technical actions. The complexities come back to haunt us. There's also a social flaw in our technological system. The design of our technologies is not representative of the people who will be affected by them. Under capitalism, for example, technologies are mostly designed by corporations. And corporations hire designers who work in the interests of the corporation. They don't consult workers and the communities that will have to host the technologies. They consult their stockholders, their business purposes. And this is not all bad. It can lead to good innovations, but it can also lead to problems because sometimes harms, unanticipated harms to workers and communities will become salient. People will be upset by the consequences of the technologies and resist. And that can give rise to protests, to feedback to the designers from the populations affected by the design, feedback based on the experience of those populations with the technologies and their consequences. And usually this leads to changes. Technical disciplines are revised, designs modified. Take the case of automotive pollution. This was not a subject of automotive engineering courses in 1952, but by the end of the 60s, the automotive engineering had to incorporate a chapter on catalytic converters and fuel injection in order to redesign cars so that they would be less polluting. So you can see here a circular movement in which technology is delivered to the public sends it back for revision. I'm going to illustrate this with a drawing made by the printmaker Escher. The drawing is itself a drawing. It's called Drawing Hands. Here it is. You can see the two hands, each drawing the other. So there's no origin, no source. It's a visual paradox. Douglas Hofstadter calls this a strange loop. A strange loop is a system in which going up the hierarchy leads to the bottom, and going down to the bottom leads to the top. So you can see that in the drawing. If you consider the if you consider the drawer the higher level of the hierarchy, and the drawn the lower level, well, if you follow the higher level to its conclusion, you come back to it as the object of drawing by what it has just drawn. Now, Hofstadter argued that there must be an inviolate level for such a weird system to exist. And this inviolate level is an actor who does not belong to the system, but who creates it. So, for example, Escher draws the drawing, but is not himself drawn by anyone. Escher occupies the inviolate level outside the paradoxical strange loop. But this exactly describes the illusion, the technical illusion, the idea of a technocracy in which society is operated like a machine by the technologists who control its technical mediations. However, in reality, there is no inviolate level. There is, as we have seen, co-construction. And I illustrate this with a cartoon that makes fun of Escher in a nice way. So here's the strange loop that no longer has an inviolate level. You can see there's a problem with this drawing. It's a visual paradox, like the Escher print. The beam goes across in an impossible way. You can't really figure out what's happening here because it's absurd. And apparently one of the workmen has figured this out. He's understood that it's an impossible situation, and he calls out, "Escher, get your ass up here." In other words, the person who designed it has to fix it. There is no escape, no conqueror of nature, no godlike stance. Escher himself is in the strange loop. Well, this leads me to a conclusion. Democracy is itself a kind of strange loop. Remember, democracy is defined as self-rule. Here you can see the reversal of the hierarchy, just as in Escher's drawing. Those who are on top are in fact subordinate to those who are on the bottom and elect them or kick them out of office. So if you think of democracy in this way as a kind of a strange loop without inviolate level, then you've got an image of how we ought to organize our technological system as well. Technology, the technologists, and their designs all belong to the system. They're not outside it. And so what we really need, ultimately, to live better in a technological society is technical democratization.